In the shadowy recesses of an abandoned house on the outskirts of Madrid, Francisco Goya created what would become one of the most haunting images in the history of Western art. Between 1819 and 1823, the aging master painter covered the walls of his home with 14 nightmarish visions that would later be known as the Black Paintings. Among them, Saturn Devouring His Son stands as perhaps the most viscerally disturbing work ever committed to canvas. But to understand this painting's true power, we must first understand the man who created it and the darkness that consumed him. By 1819, Goya was 73 years old, deaf, and deeply embittered. The Spain he had known was unraveling. The Napoleonic Wars had ravaged the country, bringing with them unspeakable atrocities that Goya had documented in his devastating Disasters of War series. The Inquisition still held sway, crushing free thought and expression. King Ferdinand VII had betrayed the constitutional reforms Goya supported, plunging Spain back into absolutist tyranny. Friends had been executed or exiled. The ideals of the Enlightenment, which Goya had championed in his youth, lay in ruins. Then, in 1819, Goya nearly died from a severe illness. When he recovered, something fundamental had changed. He purchased a country house along the Manzanares River, a property that would become known as the Quinta del Sordo, the house of the deaf man. It was here, isolated from society, that Goya began painting directly onto his walls, creating images that he never intended for public viewing. These weren't commissions. They weren't meant to please patrons or adhere to academic standards. They were raw, unfiltered expressions of a mind grappling with mortality, violence, and the darkness of human nature. The painting we now call Saturn Devouring His Son depicts the Roman god Saturn, known as Kronos in Greek mythology, in the act of consuming one of his children. According to myth, Saturn had been warned that one of his offspring would overthrow him, so he devoured each child at birth. His wife eventually tricked him, saving their youngest son, Jupiter, who would indeed grow up to defeat his father and cast him into the underworld. But Goya's interpretation transforms this classical myth into something far more primal and horrifying. This is not the composed, idealized deity of Renaissance art. This is a creature of pure madness and desperation. Saturn's eyes bulge with insane terror. His gnarled hands grip the small, pale body with desperate strength. Blood stains his fingers. The child's head and right arm are already gone, consumed. The figure of Saturn himself is barely human, more demon than god, emerging from absolute darkness. What makes this image so deeply unsettling is its raw physicality. Goya painted with fierce, brutal brushstrokes. There is no classical beauty here, no redemptive message, no moral clarity, just visceral horror. The child's body is rendered with agonizing realism, the flesh painted in sickly pale tones that make it unmistakably human. This isn't an allegory viewed from a safe distance. This is cannibalism, presented with unflinching directness. The painting's formal qualities amplify its psychological impact. The composition is claustrophobic. Saturn fills the frame, leaving no space for escape, no room for hope. The background is pure black void, suggesting that this act of violence exists outside time and space, in some eternal realm of nightmare. The light source is unclear, giving the scene an otherworldly, hallucinatory quality, as if we're witnessing something that shouldn't be possible, that violates the natural order. For decades, scholars have debated what Goya meant by this image. Some see it as a political allegory, with Saturn representing Spain itself, devouring its own enlightened children. Remember, Goya was living under a repressive regime that had betrayed the constitutional reforms he supported. He had watched friends and fellow liberals persecuted, imprisoned, and executed. The painting could be read as a savage indictment of a nation consuming its own future. Others interpret it more personally, as a meditation on time itself, the ultimate devourer. Saturn was the Roman god of time, after all. Goya, confronting his own mortality after nearly dying, may have been expressing his terror at time's inexorable march, the way it consumes everything, even our children, even our hopes, even ourselves. The painting becomes a reflection on aging, loss, and the terrible awareness that everything we love will be taken from us. Still others see it as an exploration of paternal anxiety, the dark side of fatherhood, the fear of being replaced by the next generation, the primitive, possessive instinct that sometimes lurks beneath parental love. Goya himself had fathered numerous children, but only one survived to adulthood. The painting may express grief transformed into something darker, the psychological violence of loss. But perhaps the painting's genius lies in its resistance to any single interpretation. What Goya created is an image that operates on multiple levels simultaneously: personal, political, mythological, and psychological. It speaks to our deepest fears about violence, mortality, and the capacity for horror that exists within human nature and within human institutions. What's equally remarkable is that Goya never intended anyone to see these paintings. He created them for himself alone, in the privacy of his home, knowing he was unlikely to live much longer. They were his private confrontation with darkness, painted directly onto plaster walls. It was only after his death, when the new owner decided to transfer the murals to canvas for preservation, that the world discovered these extraordinary works. This adds another layer to their power. We are essentially looking at Goya's private nightmares, his unfiltered psychological landscape. There is no artifice here, no performance for an audience. This is pure, raw expression, which is perhaps why Saturn Devouring His Son continues to disturb us nearly 200 years after its creation. The painting's influence on later art cannot be overstated. It anticipated expressionism by nearly a century. It explored psychological horror in ways that wouldn't become common in visual art until the 20th century. Francis Bacon, the 20th century master of disturbing imagery, was profoundly influenced by Goya's black paintings. So were countless others who sought to depict the darker aspects of human experience. Today, Saturn Devouring His Son hangs in the Museo del Prado in Madrid, where visitors stand transfixed and horrified before it. It remains as powerful, as shocking, as it must have been when Goya first painted it on his dining room wall. Time has not diminished its impact. If anything, the horrors of the 20th and 21st centuries, our increased awareness of systemic violence and psychological trauma, have made Goya's vision seem even more relevant, even more prophetic. What Goya understood, in his isolated house by the river, was that true horror doesn't come from external monsters or supernatural demons. It comes from within ourselves, from our institutions, from the violence that humans are capable of inflicting on each other, and most devastatingly, on those they should protect. Saturn doesn't devour his children because he is evil. He devours them because he is afraid. And that, ultimately, is what makes the painting so unbearable to witness and so impossible to forget. This has been For Art Thou. If you want to dive deeper into the shadows of history, subscribe. Next time, we go from the farmhouse of a madman to the bathtub of a martyr. Until then, keep looking closer.